Awesome. Thank you, Maddie. So let me try and get through this presentation. It's about 25, 30 minutes, and then so with a small group, we can get to a more meaty conversation. Quick sort of by the way, when I say voluntary in terms of this talk today, voluntary sector, I'm meaning everything non-profit, charity, social enterprises as well, third sector, and all related terminology. So I'll probably swap between those terms. So hopefully that still makes sense. So what I want to try and do today is to focus on introducing the circular economy and why it matters, first of all, and then trying to apply that to, or where that applies to, the voluntary sector. And then I'll touch a little bit on digital and circular economy, and try and finish up with some simple next steps. And sort of there's a fire hose of information on these topics, so hopefully it's not all too scary. By the way, I will share the link to these slides that includes all links to all the examples and so on that I mentioned. I'll share that at the end. So just to start, and it's great that we've got a small group, I think we'll do it in the chat, but to ask you a question for you. So how are you familiar with the circular economy and what that is? And if you are familiar with it, what's the sort of shortest way you could describe it? As a bit of fun, if everybody wouldn't mind opening up the chat and just throwing in your answer to that question. It's totally fine for you to say, I have no idea what you're talking about, or a little is the answer to that question. But it would be really helpful to just get a quick feel for where we all are. No problem. Awesome, thank you. Okay. Excellent, thank you, everybody. That's awesome. Yeah, no problem. No problem about video or chat. That's just really helpful to set the context. Thank you, everybody. Okay, so I want to start though, rather than starting about what it is, I want to start with why it matters. This is one of my favorite statements. This is from a UN Environment report a couple of years back. The extraction and processing of materials, fuels, and food make up about half, between 45 and 50 something %, depending on where you look, of greenhouse gas emissions, and more than 90% of biodiversity loss. That is well, it's a lot of the motivation of why I want to talk about this topic a lot. But it's more than that. So the supply chain directly connects to, I think, most of the societal and equality issues that we, particularly within the voluntary sector, that we look at. So some personal examples the sort of are the examples of what motivates me. There is a very probable chance that the laptop I'm using to speak to you today, that some of the metals that are used in that laptop were dug up by a 12-year-old child working in slave labor conditions in a mine somewhere. Because it's an old laptop, and I think it is equally true of most of our electronics. This is a regular occurrence almost, but of disasters in supply chain factories. And the example that I always use is the 2012 Bangladesh fire, where a textile factory killed 100 workers. And I think there's a direct line between our drive towards wanting cheaper stuff and the fact that those issues are all the way through the global supply chain. More recently, there's some great, all the top conversations around waste and dumping the UK waste on Asia, and more recently on Turkey. So all of those are just quick sort of tasters of why I think this conversation matters. And I think in a moment we're talking about how that directly connects to the missions that as the voluntary sector organizations are working on anyway. It's not a separate conversation. The global supply chain is underpinned by colonialism and global power dynamics, and I think the circular economy gives us one lens or one vehicle to think about those types of topics. Yeah, I wanted to sort of emphasize that this is a personal sort of what motivates me and what I think can connect to what third sector organizations' missions are tackling anyway. So every time we buy or throw away something, that's a linear process. And each time we do that as individuals, organizations, we're contributing not just to the environmental and the biodiversity and the climate change issues, but to these broader societal problems. The UN 2030 agenda talks about environmental, social, and economic sustainability objectives, and the fact that they can't be separated. So, a moment I'm going to talk about what circular economy is, but I did wanted to sort of start emphasizing the point that the circular economy, when we're not just greenwashing, requires us to think about where stuff comes from and where it goes to. And that involves shining a light on exploitation, at looking at local supply chains, at looking at communities and local partnerships, at looking at closing the loops. And all of those things create opportunities, I think, for the third sector to be even more part of the solution. So, what is it? The definition the Ellen MacArthur Foundation uses as a circular economy is based on the principles of designing out waste, pollution, and keeping products and materials in use and regenerating natural systems. Okay, that's great. What does it mean? I'll come back to that definition. Our current system is basically linear. We dig things up, we make things out of them through complex web of supply chains. We use them, there is a consumer, and then there's some magical throwing away place. I know this, I sometimes feel like this is a really obvious statement, but I think it's really important to be aware of, going back to the why, this literal journey that everything and our whole society is optimized around is a massive contributor to all of these problems. It's obviously the environmental and biodiversity and climate change questions, but also social and equality and global issues. So the circular economy, this diagram is a big systemic diagram you might have seen if you look at this, if you're familiar with the circular economy, based on the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's butterfly diagram. On the left is, and so this is about changing from a linear process going from top to bottom to loops, and about keeping physical things in use in order to reduce all of those other impacts that we talked about. It's based on starting from renewable energy, which is probably the other 50% of our climate change problem. But this diagram is quite big and complex, and it's full of lots of things, and it's talking about the economy as a whole, and there's a lot there, and so I wanted to bring that down to a more actionable, more concrete level for ourselves and our organizations. And I think one of the best tools for that, this is an example of a tool that sort of isn't the circular economy, but is an excellent tool for applying circular economy thinking. This is an extension of your old reduce, reuse, recycle thing. It's more nuanced and better. So starting from the top of the pyramid is where the most valuable, more important actions we can and should be taking are, and then down through the triangle we get to things that are less good, for want of a better term. Let me just quickly go through this. So at the top, we've got rethink and redesign, which is, I think of as a way of looking what are there alternatives to the needing stuff at all. So in a broader holistic sense, thinking about systems to discourage needless consumption, but also then more practically thinking about how services and how we use and deliver services and goods in such a way that maybe we can rethink the ownership model, for example. So that touches on things like reuse, on rent and on borrowing rather than buying new. It also covers rethinking the way products are designed and made in the first place. The next one down is reduce, where we do need things, can we use less? And I think this is where we can, the next stage of getting sort of to concrete action within organizations. So thinking about sustainable purchasing and sourcing practices, and looking at local markets, for example, and also choosing products that maximize usable lifespan and opportunities for continuous reuse. I'll try and bring in some examples to bring some of that to life shortly. Next one down is reuse. When we do have things, can we reuse them or keep them in use for as long as possible? So that's things like maintaining and repairing and refurbishing, and maximizing the sort of lifespan of those things. Note that the next one down is recycling. We haven't even got to recycling yet. Recycling and composting, the next one down. One thing I think that's really relevant to the recycling conversation is the difference between recycling to keep something at its highest value possible and recycling as a downcycling, as a single endpoint, if that makes sense. So recycling electronics might mean stripping them all the way down to the source materials and starting again. That's the sort of most involved and least valuable part of that, of recycling. Maybe what we can do is replace parts and use it again. Everything below that line where it starts to get orange and scary red is less relevant to at an organizational level, and I sort of view that point as, okay, now we're reaching the point where we're just binning the problem on somebody else, or dumping the problem on somebody else. So material recovery and residuals management is about rethinking how we do waste. There should be less getting to that point, but rethinking about how we do it is really important. There is no magic away. There is no dispose. There's something that we have to do with the stuff. And at the bottom, there's things that we shouldn't be doing, like burning. Okay, so moving from that sort of moving from that sort of theoretical stuff and trying to talk about some examples. And the circular economy is, and even the zero waste hierarchy is this broad framework of thinking. And so what I want to try and do is sort of bring that to life with some examples in the voluntary sector. But I also want to emphasize that each of the examples are part of circular thinking. No single individual or organization can be entirely perfectly the circular economy. But we can all be part of it. And tool libraries are one of my favorite and brilliant examples of that. The Edinburgh Tool Library is the one I'm using as an example here. From them, you can borrow thousands of tools, DIY and gardening tools especially, but they also bring members together to build and learn together by sharing skills and knowledge. And so they're brilliant examples of literally extending the life of physical products, potentially reducing the amount that we need to earn because we need to own because we can share them, and increasing reuse and the lifespan of those products. But also, they're usually wonderful community hubs incorporating skill sharing and all of those things, as well as the environmental benefits. Here's another fun example, the bike project, who literally take donated bikes, fix them up a little bit, and donate them on to refugees, folks for whom some method of transport might be the difference between a meal and an exercise and a whole life-changing thing. So I'm not suggesting that either of those two things are the circular economy, but they're brilliant examples of applying circular economy thinking. The circular economy and that zero waste hierarchy are frameworks. They're tools. They're not another thing to do. They're tools or frameworks that we can take and apply to stuff that we're doing already and make it better. And they are often talking about this high level sort of systemic thing, and so and economy-wide, like it's literal economy. So it's about finding our place in that. I want to emphasize the last phrase of that definition, regenerating natural systems. I have an entire other rant presentation about the difference between paradigms around doing less bad and doing good, and moving to genuine regeneration thinking. And my point of just mentioning that here is that the circular economy is like reuse and waste is sort of the practical part of the circular economy in reality, but it's this broader, it's this opportunity to have this broader systemic thinking about the role of all of our things in our society. And as an observation, notice that most of the examples, those two I just gave and more I'll give in a moment, they don't put circular economy out in neon. They're not saying we are circular economy. And they're not even necessarily focused on environmental or waste causes. And rather they're using things like reuse, repair and sharing to keep things in value, in value for maximum time, but also as a way to add value to their communities and their missions and their own environmental impact. Another example, ILM Highland, obviously in the Highlands of Scotland, they do home improvement services and free support to vulnerable folks in their community, enabling them to maintain their independence. But interestingly, to support those services, they do extensive electrical recycling services to public and businesses, and run local and online retail store selling quality and refurbished appliances. And as part of that, spare parts and repair services for electrical appliances. I really like that example as, again, it's not their core mission, but it's a way of, and in this case, helping to fund and support those services that is also feeding into the whole mission as well. It's this broader sort of with local communities and with and so on. Another awesome example, Recycling Lives, who support men and women in prisons across the UK to reduce reoffending rates by engaging them in meaningful work to develop skills and confidence. But one of the skills they develop is repair and recycling of waste electricals. And the interesting thing there is the circular economy benefits are almost incidental. Repair and recycling is one of the methods they use for helping people, not the end in itself. Another awesome example of applying, taking, and there's levels you could grow on top of that of taking circular economy thinking to multiply and add to the mission, not just in and of itself. As an aside, there's an awesome opportunity in the broader economy. Research from people like ZeroWaste Scotland indicate that the circular economy, a transition to a more circular economy can be a real job creator. And another example, this time talking about food. A lot of you might be familiar with FairShare, 18 different independent organizations that take surplus food and share it to frontline charities and community groups. The interesting thing about the reason I mentioned this example is that too often I think we think of recycling, as circular economy as recycling of physical things, but the circular economy mindset applies to everything we do. So that includes food and the packaging and all those things that are around that. So I maintain that the voluntary sector is ahead of the game with the circular economy, even though much of the sector maybe hasn't even heard the term or aware of the language, but we all will be, or everyone will be aware of terms similar to the waste hierarchy, reduce and reuse and so on, recycling. And so doing things like collecting and using and distributing, donating items, including things like charity shops, like classic stuff, is being part of circular. That is circularity. So I firmly believe that the third sector is an opportunity, is in the perfect opportunity to take that and really run with it. Not just, but also because of things like cost savings and the sort of tradition and income earning, the sort of traditional reasons to do those things, but also because there's an opportunity to take that to the next level in terms of environmental impact and complementing and multiplying the missions. On top of all of that, I focused a lot there on sort of mission connected actions and external, if you like, environmental benefits. I think the circular economy is also another string to the bow of looking at our internal sustainability and goals. The nonprofit sector has a responsibility, just like the rest of society, to rethink our impact in the context of the climate crisis. And circular economy thinking and mindsets can help with that. There's three very broad areas I wanted to touch on, to just trying to give that a little bit of context. The first one is sourcing. So everything from buildings and events and people and equipment, by looking at taking some of the stuff and thinking about things like the ZeroWaste hierarchy to look at ways to reduce the stuff that we need. Can we rethink services and the way that we use stuff? This is, by the way, is one obvious place that digitization and digital transformation comes in. And then for things that are needed, where do the supplies come from? I think there's a really interesting opportunities to further look at local community and thinking in terms of loops of where things come and where things go. The second focus area then being in use and being more having another reason to look at life, the length of life, and the things like proactive repair and reuse and sharing of assets. And then the third one being next use. So not disposal or waste, but next use, where there is no magic away place. So obviously that includes currently the reality of waste and rubbish, but is there ways that we can think about tackling that. And there's lots of interesting things around measuring and maximizing recycling. Sorry, this is in addition to reducing things getting to that point, and looking at ways where waste can become input for other organizations. For example, Glasgow wood recycling is a brilliant local, again, another example of a local community project, taking wood waste, in this case in Glasgow, and making quality furniture, and again, matching that with volunteering and training opportunities as a way to help with things like social exclusion and unemployment. Or Repair Cafe Wales, another example where what they do is they open and support repair cafes across Wales, and to use their words, in the simplest form, repair cafes are pop-up events held on regular dates where the local community can get broken household items repaired for free by volunteers. A combination of waste reduction, skill sharing, and community building. So, to try and take all of that context setting and those examples and to look at all of the digital opportunity through the lens of circular economy, I want to emphasize that again. I really think the circular economy is not another thing to do. It's an umbrella term for a framework or set of frameworks and thinking that can be applied to further multiply and improve things that we're probably doing already, and take them to the next level. But the first thing so I work, this is my day job, I do a digital, but I always want to start with the elephant in the room, and that digital is part of the problem as well. So the internet uses a lot of power, more than the whole of the UK. The internet as a whole would be larger contribution towards carbon contribution in the UK. And e-waste, so not just phones and laptops and computers and things, but also cables and wires and chargers and little bits and pieces, is the fastest growing source of waste. And it's getting worse. So the design and the business models of all the people that supply the stuff that we use is making things worse. And therefore, it's our responsibility as individuals and organizations and as a sector, when we consider digital, to limit our contribution to the problem. And I refer back to things like the waste hierarchy and what we talked about in meeting our own sustainability goals. Continuing the negative theme, there's also the broader conversation in terms of digital around unintended negative consequences, like touching on things like, which I'm not trying to even touch here, but things like mental health and digital exclusion. As an aside, one of the ways when looking at digital projects, and you want to think about how to identify and limit these kinds of negative consequences, there's a practice from .everyone called consequence scanning. So I would point people who are interested in doing that, particularly with larger digital projects, and .everyone, or message me if you're interested more on that. Having said all of that, obviously the opportunity with digital is huge. I won't try and go into a lot of specifics on this conversation. What I want to do rather is just touch on where and how, touch on what the circular economy lens is, and then talk about, okay, applying that to digital projects that are happening anyway is a useful multiplier. So the obvious things like digital projects creating opportunities to reduce or replace physical things, everything from paper and office equipment to travel and capital assets. And there's the sort of really exciting and also forced on us over the last 18 months need to change the way, to rethink the way services are delivered, for example, and using digital as a vehicle for that. Hopefully we can take the positives of being rushed into that, and then add just a little dribble of circular economy thinking. And I think we've got the elements there for an awesome recipe. So my point is that digital transformation and circular economy are not the same. It may be that circular economy things should be actioned without digital pieces to them, but when it's applicable, the two can be added together and be real catalysts and multiplier effects for missions and for sustainable impact. As I've said, and I'll keep saying, the circular economy is not an extra thing to do. It's a mindset that can be used to find new opportunities and think and rethink about things that we're doing already and how to get to take them further. And when relevant, supported by sensible digital evolution or digital transformation, that's where the opportunities are. And the third thing under the digital umbrella is digital transformation is about as much or probably more about approaches and mindsets as it is about apps and websites and things. So being able to look and learn about things like agile practices and design thinking, which and the sort of approaches to those things, that's the real strength in digital evolution, digital transformation, and taking things like the learnings from the pandemic. And the same process, the same thing, the same points applies to circular economy. It's not another thing to do. It's about sort of iterating and stepping on a journey towards this change. As a quick aside, and I won't try and touch on it now, but if you read or look about circular economy and digital as an enabler in the broader economic sense, they will throw out massive. You'll see a lot of buzzwords, terminology, and Industry 4.0, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, cloud, blockchain, all these big scary words. All of that is true. Those things are tools and they are relevant when applied in the right place. I think all of that doesn't matter without this conceptual understanding of the mindset and a clear understanding of, okay, how we're going to explore applying these opportunities to what we want to do anyway. I want to just, because it's more fun to talk about examples. So the Edinburgh Remakery is a brilliant example of tying in very local and loops. So repairing and refurbish and recycling what others sent, this to use their own words, what others sent to landfill and pass those repair skills on to others in the Edinburgh community through education. On their website, they talk about in 2018, they diverted 60 tons from landfill and educated over 1,400 people in repair and reuse skills. So they are a brilliant example of somebody that, when I talk about partnerships and working together as being part of this broader loop. Which is one of the final points I wanted to make. There is this opportunity to take digital evolution, digital transformation changes and apply the circular economy approaches and circular economy mindset to really positively impact both the organization's own environmental and social impact and also the mission and the broader societal conversation. And partnerships and working together is key. The circular economy is this broad economic-wide thing, and each of us it's virtually impossible to be perfectly circular individually, but we can be part of this conversation about moving towards the circles and thinking about that. And again, there's another example, in my opinion, of the third sector being potentially placed to really really take advantage of some of this terminology and these frameworks to really multiply and take work that's happening already, spread it across the sector and reach it out beyond the sector too. A couple of quick examples of specific partnerships. So I'm kind of hoping that some of those examples of charities and social enterprises that are using circular economy do trigger thinking about connections and partnerships and working together. So for example, community events, repair cafes or repair skills workshops are an excellent vehicle just to add to any form of community event. And then if anyone is thinking about things more concretely, for example, actions, for example, looking at community lending libraries like the Edinburgh Tool Library, there are platforms I would mention myturn.com and libraryofthings.co.uk. There are platforms and organizations to help those happen. I use that as an example rather than as that there are partnerships to help and platforms to help implement some of these circular approaches. Okay, so That's a lot of stuff. Let me try and sort of bring it down to leave you with a couple of two very specific things. The first one is the zero waste hierarchy. I think that's a useful tool and framework to think about how can we take our first steps towards really thinking about circular economy. And then the second one is is design hops, which are charity workshops put together by CAST and in Scotland organised by Digital for Good, the community group. They aren't circular economy specific, but they are an excellent vehicle and the right thinking for how to approach all of these, the digitization and the circular economy approaches, taking one step at a time. So that's everything from me. I want to leave you with a couple of links in Scotland. That's ZeroWaste Scotland and SCVO, Digital for Good, and there's a few links in the notes, show notes that I'll share outside Scotland as well. I am extremely open to questions now and by my email there. Very finally, I'll share this link, but as out of this talk, I started putting together a list of circular economy in the third sector examples. That link is that list, and I would love if people wanted to chip in and help build and bring that a bit more to life. But this is the link you want. If you want to take away any of the slides or links or stuff that I've just shared. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Do you want to stop sharing and I'll stop recording?